A verse-by-verse study in the book of Hebrews, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 1. What does Hebrews chapter 1 mean? The book of Hebrews is intended to solidify Jewish believers' trust in Jesus as all they need for salvation. At the same time, the book provides several stern warnings about the consequences of rejecting Jesus. The first chapter of Hebrews begins by pointing out that God does, in fact, speak to his people. In the past, this was through various prophets, Hebrews 1 verse 1. Now, however, that message is primarily through Jesus Christ, Hebrews 1 verse 2. The writer of Hebrews starts by pointing out that Jesus is not an angel or other created being. Rather, Jesus is identical to God. This was an especially important distinction to make in the very early church. Jewish thought commonly held that angels would rule the world one day. According to the actual Word of God, quoted here in Hebrews, this is not the case. The Promised One, also known as the Messiah, is given descriptions which cannot match any angel. In fact, what the Jewish scriptures say about Messiah make it clear that this figure is actually divine. Chapters 1 and 2 are mostly made up of a list of Old Testament quotations. These are used to provide several points of evidence that Jesus is above and beyond any angel. Verses 1-4 of chapter 1 summarize this idea. Verse 5 cites Psalm 2 verse 7 and 2 Samuel 7 verse 14. These verses highlight the fact that the Promised One is not the same as an angel, but is labeled as the Son of God. Verses 6 and 7 portray angels as servant beings. These creatures worship God and serve God. They have a shifting, changing nature, depending on the tasks they are assigned by God. In contrast, according to verses 8 through 14, Jesus is given ultimate authority, and has a nature which is unchanging and eternal. He is not worshipping, but he is worshipped. The distinction between Jesus and these angels is clear. These proofs will continue through chapter 2, which opens with the first of several warnings about the danger of rejecting Christ and his message. Chapter context. The first chapter of Hebrews establishes two primary ideas used to support the rest of the book. First, that God has spoken to mankind, most recently through Jesus, so we ought to be listening to him. Secondly, chapter 1 introduces the fact that Jesus is superior to other spiritual beings, such as angels. These concepts are used to support the superiority of faith in Christ over the Old Testament law, expressed in the book's later chapters. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Hebrews begins with a reference to God's communication with mankind. The letter is primarily written to Jewish believers, who placed great importance on the prophets of the Old Testament. Verses 1 and 2 explain that God spoke through prophets in the past, and speaks now through Jesus Christ. This is an important point for several reasons. First, this reminds us that the Old Testament and New Testament are not contradictory. The message of God given by the prophets is not different than the message of God given through Christ. The same God is speaking, continuing to show us more and more of his plans. Second, this emphasizes how important it is to listen to the message of Christ. If God is speaking, then we ought to listen. The Jewish people, in particular, would have been sensitive to this idea. Israel was the chosen nation, given special attention by God. The message of the prophets was given to Israel, and God expected them to listen to what he said. Here, the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand that when God speaks, we have an obligation to pay attention. This is the background for this letter's many warnings against abandoning the gospel. Context summary. Hebrews 1 verses 1-4 summarizes the entire book of Hebrews. God has spoken to mankind in many ways, but now he speaks to us through Christ. This same man, Jesus Christ, is also God, and shares in all aspects of the divine nature. Jesus' superiority over all other things is summarized in his symbolic position, seated at the right hand of God the Father. Everything which follows in the book of Hebrews supports this same basic theme: Christ is above and beyond all other things. Verse 2. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. Verses 1 and 2 of Hebrews emphasize the fact that Christ is the latest part of God's continuous, consistent message. Where God had spoken through the prophets of the Old Testament, he now speaks through the person of Jesus Christ. These are not contradictory messages. Jesus is the Messiah of whom those prophets spoke. Since this is a message from God, it stands to reason that those who love God ought to listen. Knowing that Jesus is a message from God, and is the ultimate truth sets the table for this letter's many warnings against rejecting the gospel. The end of verse 2 also introduces an idea which is fundamental to the Christian faith: Jesus Christ is God. The first 4 verses of this book establish that Jesus is not some created being or a higher form of angel. According to verse 3, Jesus is the exact imprint of the nature of God. This is the consistent teaching of the Bible, that Christ is both fully God and fully man. The words of this verse echo the Gospel of John, which notes that all things were made through Christ, and without Christ was not anything made that was made, John 1 verse 3. This establishes that Jesus is, in fact, part of the uncreated and eternal God. All things which were made by God, the only thing not made is the eternal Creator. Verse 3. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. A major theme of the book of Hebrews is the supremacy of Christ. Faced with persecution, there is a temptation to follow the crowd. Jewish Christians of that era would have been under pressure to return to Judaism, rather than continue as Christians. The first 4 verses of Hebrews serve as an introduction to the idea that Jesus is the better way. This verse also provides important support for the divinity of Jesus. That is, these words imply that Jesus Christ is, in fact, God. The Greek word character is translated here as exact imprint or exact representation. The Greek word for nature here is hypostasios. This is the source of the theological term hypostatic union, a fancy way of saying that Jesus is both God and man. Combined, these words mean that Jesus' nature is identical to that of God. Christ is divine, exactly as God is divine. The reference to sitting at the right hand is important in ancient literature. This is a symbolic reference to honor and power. A person seated at the right hand of the king was considered trustworthy, and he was bestowed with the power of that king. References to Jesus as seated at the right hand of the Father imply his absolute power and authority. Verse 4. Having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Verse 4 makes another reference to the superiority of Jesus. In prior verses, the writer has explained that God's message to mankind is now being given through Jesus. Since Jesus Christ is the exact imprint of the nature of God, he is the ultimate authority. These verses also remind a reader that Jesus is the Creator, he is not a created being. This makes him superior to all other beings, including the angels. Worship of angels, and other spiritual beings, was not uncommon in the day this letter was written. Part of the point of verse 4 is that Jesus is not on the same level as these beings. He is far, far above them. Even if an angel were to appear and give a different message than that of Christ, Christ would still be the superior authority, Galatians 1 verse 8. The name of Jesus, in this context, has more to do with status and reputation than just a personal label. Jesus' position as divine, his role as creator, and his work in reconciling God and man make him more excellent than any other conceivable spiritual being. The following verses will give explicit Old Testament proof that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is not merely some angelic being. Rather, he is the unique and all-powerful Son of God. Verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father and he shall be to me a son"? Verses 1 through 4 describe Jesus as above any angel, both in power and authority. Starting in verse 5, the writer of Hebrews presents specific evidence from the Old Testament to support this. According to the prophets, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is not some created being or spiritual power. He is the unique and superior Son of God. This explanation will continue through all of chapter 2. The writer will pause, however, in Hebrews 2 verses 1 to 4 to give the first of several warnings against rejecting the gospel message. The first citation given is from Psalm 2 verse 7. This psalm describes the crowning of a king, accompanied by celebration. Meanwhile, in other pagan nations, people opposed this new ruler. Psalm 2 encourages the other territories to obey God and to follow his chosen leader. Psalm 2 verse 7 specifically implies that this new ruler derives his right to the throne from his relationship to God. The expression, "I have begotten you," from this verse does not refer to biology, but to authority. The writer of Hebrews uses this reference to support his claim that Jesus is an authority far above and beyond any angel. This same verse, Psalm 2 verse 7, is quoted by Paul, who also makes the connection between it and the Messiah, Acts 13 verse 33. The second Old Testament citation is from 2 Samuel 7 verse 14. This is part of a message given to King David, where God speaks through the prophet Nathan. In its immediate context, the verse refers to the literal family of David, since it also describes the penalties David's son would endure for disobedience. The writer of Hebrews is extending this concept of lineage, along with the reference in Psalm 2 verse 7, to apply to the ultimate descendant of David, Jesus Christ. This connects to the idea of Jesus being highly honored, as mentioned in Hebrews 1 verse 3. Context summary: Hebrews 1 verses 5 to 14 uses a collection of Old Testament quotations. These are used to support the claims made in verses 1 through 4. In particular, the writer is explaining that Jesus Christ is not merely some angelic being or a created spiritual power. He is the exact nature of God and above all other authorities. Since this letter is written to a Jewish audience, this use of Old Testament material is crucial and would have been especially effective. This explanation continues through the entire second chapter of Hebrews. Verse 6. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." This is part of an extended series of Old Testament quotes. The writer of Hebrews seeks to prove, from the Jewish scriptures, that Jesus Christ is a superior authority to any angel or other spiritual being. This list of evidence will continue through chapter 2, pausing only briefly to deliver a warning against ignoring the message of God. Verse 5 made reference to Psalm 2 verse 7, which refers to a newly crowned king as begotten. In that context, the meaning was coming into power and authority. Verse 5 also quoted from 2 Samuel 7 verse 14, which connected the idea of God's role in king-making to the lineage of David. Here, in verse 6, the idea of "again," when he brings the firstborn, is really meant to connect the words "bring" and "again." In other words, this is a reference to the second coming of Jesus. This is the time when God will again bring Jesus into the world. At this point in time, instead of being a poor and humble figure, Messiah will be a conquering and mighty figure, openly worshipped by the angels. The writer of Hebrews makes this link through Psalm 97 verse 7, though some also see a reference to Deuteronomy 32 verse 43. Hebrews uses quotations from the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament made by Jewish scholars. This results in some subtly different wording than is found in other, direct from Hebrew citations. In this instance, the word translated as God's, with a small letter G, in Psalm 97 verse 7, is from a Hebrew term Elohim, a plural term which is sometimes used for God, and other times for generic spiritual beings. The Septuagint translators chose the Greek term for angels, which corresponds to the context of the passage. Verse 7. Of the angels he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. This verse continues a string of proofs from the Old Testament, showing that Jesus is more than simply an angelic being. In fact, according to these scriptures, he is unique in his power and authority, and equal to God. Verse 7 has to be read along with verses 8 and 9 to fully grasp the point. The writer of Hebrews is making a distinction between angels, who God treats as servants, and the Messiah, who God treats as a ruler. In this case, the reference is to Psalm 104 verse 4. Psalm 104 celebrates God's creative power and his blessing on all he has created. Psalm 104 verse 4 specifically refers to God directing the actions of his messengers, which is from the Hebrew word malachi, the same term translated as angels. The point being made is that angels are beings commanded by God as servants. They are not invested with authority. Instead, they are used in much the same way as other parts of creation. This verse also suggests that God sometimes delivers his message, via his angels, using them through the natural world. Some see this as part of the contrast Hebrews is presenting, as well. While angels, per Psalm 104 verse 4, have a flexible nature, sometimes appearing as flames or wind, the upcoming scriptures will show that Christ has an eternal and unchanging nature, further proof that he is God. Verses 8 and 9 will contrast the servant status of angels with the ruling status of Jesus Christ. Verse 8. But of the Son he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. Verses 8 and 9 contrast with verse 7. Verse 7 indicated that angels are servants, arranged and molded by God for his purposes. Here, the writer of Hebrews contrasts this servanthood with the rulership bestowed on Jesus. This follows the theme of this passage of the Bible, proving from the Jewish scriptures that Jesus is superior to any angel or created being. Here, the author quotes from Psalm 45 verses 6 to 7, in a reference running through verse 9. This Old Testament passage heralds the ultimate victory of the Messiah. Like other Old Testament references used in Hebrews, there are multiple layers of meaning implied in these verses. Psalm 45 is most directly about an earthly king's wedding. The symbolism and meaning are also echoes of the relationship between Jesus, who is King and Messiah, and his spiritual bride, the Church. Psalm 45 verses 6 to 7 specifically praises the moral strength of this king, as well as the nature of his throne, forever and ever. This stands in contrast to the idea of the flexible, servant-oriented angels referenced in Hebrews 1 verse 7. Psalm 45 verse 6 describes this kingly figure as one with a scepter, a clear symbol of power and authority. Verse 9. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness, therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. This verse continues a quotation of Psalm 45 verses 6 to 7, which is mentioned to show that the Messiah is invested with an everlasting throne and godly authority. Hebrews 1 verse 7 gave a contrasting reference to angels as servants, with shifting characteristics. This Old Testament reference, begun in verse 8, is meant to prove that Jesus Christ is clearly not an angel or some other created being. Psalm 45 verse 7, quoted here in Hebrews 1 verse 9, again emphasizes the moral status of this king. This pair of verses, with Psalm 45 verse 6, quoted in Hebrews 1 verse 8, also frames a prophecy about the nature of David's lineage. The Messiah is the ultimate fulfillment of this promise, that David's line would never end and his throne would be established forever. As is often the case with the Old Testament, there are multiple layers of meaning involved. While the psalm most directly applies to the wedding of an earthly king, Hebrews shows how it also gives application for understanding the promised one, Jesus. Verse 10. And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. The writer of Hebrews is collecting Old Testament quotations in order to prove a point about Jesus. The idea is that Jesus is not a created entity or on the same level as angels. Rather, Jesus is equal to God and has an authority far above all other spiritual beings. In order to show this, prior verses have quoted Old Testament scriptures which show that the Messiah is given qualities angels do not possess. Verses 10 through 12 quote from Psalm 102 verses 25 to 27. This is connected to the quotation of Psalm 45 verses 6 to 7 which ended in Hebrews 1 verse 9. Both passages show that Jesus, as God, and as Messiah, has a regal, unchanging, eternal nature. On the other hand, angels were shown in Hebrews 1 verse 7 to be shifting, created, servant beings. Psalm 102 is a cry to God over persecution. The psalmist feels overrun and overtaken by his enemies. And yet, because of his trust in an unchanging and eternal God, he is able to find comfort. Verses 25 through 27 explicitly point out the creative work of God and his timeless nature. This, coming from the writer of Hebrews, is a clear statement of Jesus' divinity. Verse 11. They will perish, but you remain, they will all wear out like a garment. Verses 10 through 12 repeat a passage from Psalm 102 verses 25 to 27. These words are from a psalm which praises God for being unchanging and eternal. This is seen by the psalmist as a reason to trust God, even when it seems like enemies are winning the battle. The writer of Hebrews means to connect this idea of permanence to the ideas mentioned in prior verses. This portion of Hebrews is dedicated to the idea that Jesus is not the equal of angels. On the contrary, he is above and beyond all angels, and is in fact identical to God. Verses such as Hebrews 1 verse 7 described angels as servants, with characteristics God can change to suit his purposes. Messiah, on the other hand, is portrayed as the ultimate authority, and as one who does not fade or change. Upcoming verses will continue drawing this distinction between the Scripture's depiction of angels and the Scripture's depiction of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Verse 12. Like a robe you will roll them up, like a garment they will be changed, but you are the same and your years will have no end. The first two chapters of Hebrews are mostly dedicated to proving, from the Old Testament, that Jesus is an authority far greater than any angel. This is shown by collecting various quotations from Jewish scriptures, comparing their depiction of angels to their depiction of the Messiah. Verses 10 through 12 are a quotation from Psalm 102 verses 25 to 27. In that psalm, God is praised for being unchanging, faithful, and eternal. This gives the psalmist confidence even when enemies seem to be winning. In Hebrews 1 verse 7, it was pointed out that angels are shifting, changing beings. This means that the promised one, Jesus Christ the Messiah, cannot be an angel. Another point made in these verses is that Jesus is a figure of authority and power. Angels, on the other hand, are depicted as servants. The writer of Hebrews wants his readers to understand that the promises, messages, and decrees made in the Old Testament to the promised one are not the same as the words given to angels. This is part of the writer's intent of proving that God, who once spoke through prophets, is now speaking through Jesus. Verse 13. And to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? The primary purpose of the first two chapters of Hebrews is to prove that Jesus is not an angel. Rather, he is eternal, unchanging, and supreme in his authority. In other words, the Messiah promised in the Old Testament is actually God himself. The writer of Hebrews has stated that God's message once came through prophets, and now comes through Jesus. Showing that Jesus is not merely some created spiritual being is crucial to the rest of this letter. Verses 13 and 14 make one last comparison between Jesus and angels, before chapter 2 begins with a dire warning. This verse quotes Psalm 110 verse 1, where the promised one is given the place of ultimate honor, the right hand of God. The writer of Hebrews is using this passage for the same purpose as Jesus. Christ also cited Psalm 110 verse 1, Matthew 22 verses 41 to 46, Mark 12 verses 35 to 37, also as a way of proving that the prophesied king would be the Son of God. Psalm 110 itself does not seem to connect directly to any event in the life of David. Rather, it seems to be a vision of the future, one which connects to the coming Messiah. In Hebrews 1 verse 14, the idea of the promised one being a ruler is directly contrasted to the nature of angels as servants. Verse 14. Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Verse 13 made it clear that God has never said words like those quoted from Psalm 110 verse 1 to any angel. Rather, the Bible consistently portrays angels as servants. They are not shown as authority figures, but merely as obeying the will of God under His direction, Judges 6 verses 11 to 18, Psalm 103 verse 20, Daniel 6 verse 22. This is important for the point the writer of Hebrews is making in this passage. God is not giving rule and authority to angels, but to Christ. Chapters 1 and 2 are mostly a collection of Old Testament scriptures, meant to prove that Jesus is a higher authority than any angel. God once spoke to man through prophets, Hebrews 1 verse 1, and now He is speaking through Jesus Christ, Hebrews 1 verse 2. As a result, the readers of this letter ought to listen to the message of Jesus just as intently as they would the Old Testament message of God. The first verses of chapter 2 are, in fact, the first of several warnings in Hebrews about the consequences of rejecting this message. These verses all combine to prove that Jesus is unchanging, eternal, and full of authority. He is not a created being, He is identical to God. End of chapter 1. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.